Welcome back for another book review. Today we're talking about this massive book. This is Triumph of the Moon, the new edition. So this is A History of Modern Pagan Witchcraft by Ronald Hutton. So this, I really didn't know much about, honestly. Again, I just grabbed books from the library, and so inevitably this one was one that I had stumbled across, and I didn't know it was gonna be this big. Now granted, a lot of the second half of this book, okay, from here back, this is all just the end notes to give you context. Like that's a lot of end notes. This is also a really small font book, and like every single word matters in this one, and like it is not written easily. This is extremely academic. He's a professor. So like naturally it's gonna be like super academic. It's not a bad thing. Because sometimes the academics feel like they're like trying to talk above you. He's not. It's just like you can tell that like there's like people that like feel like they have to be smart to like talk down to you. And then there's people that are just smart and that sometimes like they don't realize that they're trying to like talk very academically. Like that's just how they talk because that's just how they are. They just research and teach and like that just naturally becomes who they are and how they speak naturally. And it was definitely more of that. Like I don't think he's trying to like talk, like again there's like the academics that feel like they're just like sitting on like a council level looking down upon you, like that scene in Harry Potter where like they're at like the court thing and they're all like staring down at you. That kind of a vibe. Like it's not like that. It just feels like you're sitting down with someone who's like probably really a lot smarter than the majority of us. Like let's just be honest, like most of us aren't going to be like hugely major like academic. Most of us are gonna have more average jobs, more average lives where the academic world is not our thing. We might have gone to college maybe, and like this is the opposite. This is where you're studying all the stuff. You're in that world constantly. And I say that because, like, again, some of the wording, like, you're not gonna find in, like, any of the other witchy books. Like, there's a lot of words where you're like, I didn't know people legitimately actually use these words. Like, oh, what was it? Like, hitherto and stuff like that. And there's just a few words kind of like that where you're just like, okay. But for the most part, this is not too hard to read, but it's also like, okay, there's been this thing that I've seen on TikTok that like, and I swear they talked about it when I was in school, but basically at some point when you learn how to read, your brain doesn't read the whole word. It will autocorrect. It will read some of the words, like some of the letters, and it will assume the word. And then you read it as if it was that word, and if it doesn't make sense, then you reread that sentence to like confirm like, oh, okay, actually, I do have to look at all the letters. You can't do that with this book. This book is like, you gotta read every single word, and like, cause there are some that like, I literally had to stop and feel like I was in third grade again and go look it up, cause I'm like, even context clues, I have never heard this word before. And again, it's not a bad thing. It does make you expand like your literary knowledge. But like this is, needless to say, not an easy book to read. It's not bad. It's actually really good and I highly recommend it to everybody, but just be aware, like most books I can read, even this big of a book, I've read this size of a book, even without the endnotes part excluded. I can read this kind of a book in a day. That's not an issue for me. It might be a whole day nonetheless, but like I can do it. This one I couldn't. This is one of those that it's like you really have to sit and like read every word very slowly to make sure you don't forget anything, because by the next paragraph you're gonna need to remember what just happened in the next one, because like the author, I think, legitimately really had to condense the knowledge as much as possible. And so because of that, like every single word counts. And there's a lot of books where that doesn't apply. I think he could have made this like 3 times as big and it still wouldn't be enough. And I think the author would agree, honestly. But like the way he writes so much of this, it's like, it's really interesting sentence by sentence. It's not too bad, but like you really have to pay attention. And like I've compared it, even the next book I'm reading, like, it's so much more chill. Like, again, small font, not a lot of pictures. All the pages are like this. Like, you're just constant, once in a while you get a picture. Once in a blue moon you get a picture. But for the most part, it's just text upon text upon text, and it's really small font. And that means it's a really high word count, and again, it's from an academic perspective, so like, you're constantly like having to keep track of dates and names and places, and I don't know the area, so like, none of, like, especially the first part, he's like talking about all of these towns and stuff, and I'm like, are these actually places? Like, these names are so whimsical and fun. But like, of course, because like, so many fairy tales are based out of like the UK and Europe, so like you get like these whimsical fun names that you're like, oh right, that's like a real place. But like, anyways, this book, it does take a lot of brain power to get through because, again, it's written from an academic perspective, but it is so good. And maybe that's why it took a little bit longer, because I really wanted to absorb the information, because I've said this 1,000 times. The history that's presented in, I would say, at least 98, 99% of the witchcraft books are not actual history, and that bothers me. And this book defunks it and also explains it, and you can see the journey of how we got to where we are, and like the why in a lot of instances. Not necessarily from like a witch perspective of like how, why exactly, like why is the East with air, but you can see where the directions and like why we have the 4 elements and the 4 cardinal directions. Why is there so much ceremony? Why does it always have to come from a long lineage at all times? All that stuff is covered in this book. And then it also, like, it starts off as far back as like realistically you could kind of go for like pagan witchcraft. And it starts off, I think it was like the 1700s, maybe even the 1600s, something around there. Like, it started off really early, but eventually like the main focus became like kind of how the Freemasons started, and then how they started to evolve. And then eventually that started to kind of become like the occult, and then you've got like Aleister Crowley, and like there was a lot of people before Aleister Crowley that you're like, when are we getting to him? Like, that's a big old name that everyone kind of refers to, but it takes a long time to get to him. And then you realize that like from there, like it's a weird time twist to eventually get to where we're at Gerald Gardner. That was like halfway through the book just to get to Gardner. And then you realize how much of what he taught and he created came from all of these other things, and you like got to see the journey to get there. And then like the end kind of was like this rapid like boom, and then we're in the present day. And like the modern stuff, I feel like we could have fleshed out a little more, but also it's the history, so maybe we don't care as much about like modern, because there was a lot of emphasis from like the 1950s and 60s-ish back, but like from there forward there was like a little bit, and there was like a little bit more, but also he was like at the same time like British version and American version kind of diverged a bit, and like he's like, we're not talking about the American history, we're talking about a British history, because that's all this is. And it's like, well, fine. And it's so crazy because it's like the influence and how people from like across the pond over there and across the country for me really, like how different, and like how it's just so interesting to me to see how it's like there was a thing of like how it's like a Californication something, whatever. California specifically influences like the world. And it's crazy because it's like, it's kind of really true, but like so much of witchcraft and Wicca changed from California, and it affected the world. And it was so interesting, and it was interesting to see how like Wicca really like took on a new like whole different direction when it came to like the 1970s or something. Maybe it was the 60s, somewhere around there, where like feminism really got like involved in it, and then you suddenly start getting these different branches going off. And he talks about it a little bit, and I was like just waiting for like the conversation with like Scott Cunningham and Silver Ravenwolf, and then it didn't happen, and I was really bummed because like to me that's another big twist in the Wicca branch, so to speak, of like where it was like, okay, but listen, we had covens, we had established stuff, and then like Scott Cunningham and a few others started to come in, and I do think it was really Scott Cunningham. I might be wrong, but I feel like it was him. I feel like it was mentioned that like he is the one that really took a stand, like publicly, loudly, of like, you don't need a witch to create a witch. You don't need that lineage, you can do it yourself. And I think it was really him who started that. Like there was a little bit with the feminist groups, but also kind of not. Because like Dianic Wicca, you still have to be initiated, I'm pretty sure, especially back in the day. Might have changed now. But like, I was hoping for that conversation and how like, we started to get more like, again, Silver Ravenwolf, where she kind of branched off that concept as well, and like Dorothy Morrison, but no, we don't have that. So I was a little bummed not to see that at the very end. But otherwise, this is like the book I wish I would have found a lot sooner in my craft. Because the history that so many people refer back to is like debunked, and not in like a bad way. Like the author does this so respectfully for someone who isn't part of our community, and like I don't think has any desire to, but like he presents it in such a way and is so like respectful while also being like, it's kind of total BS. They handpicked some stuff to make it work, and it didn't. Like, I think it was, I don't remember the area, somewhere obviously in Britain, there was like this argument of like, you have to have like the ancient great goddess, you know, like the Venus figures kind of a deal. Like a goddess figure that was like huge, central to each area of the world. Britain didn't have one. They mostly had like burial mounds and like the Stonehenge and Woodhenge and all of the other things, and like stone circles. They didn't have a goddess figure, like a central mega epic goddess figure. That just wasn't a thing. And then like in the book he talks about how it was kind of supposedly found, and like the details surrounding it, like all of the scholars are like, what? No! Like mysteriously the notes of like the archaeological like find notes mysteriously stopped on the day it was found, and like it was just really sketch. And it's like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. Like it's like eventually it got debunked, and then you also have like Margaret, I think her last name's Murray, who really made up history completely, just made it to fit her narrative, and like the scholars of the day definitely like had issue with it. But there's also a big divide between like the academic world and like the modern like average person. Like the regular folk and the academic folk, those circles didn't always necessarily overlap too much. So when she went to that group, suddenly that was the information. I was like, hell yeah, totally, yeah, definitely. And everyone quotes her, and I've seen it so many times in so many books of like the ancient goddess traditions, the like, instead of a patriarchy, you have a matriarchy in the past. Like there's just a lot of it that like the scholars have like debunked multiple times, but there's still so many people that use that history. And then sometimes they'll admit that like it's not a real history, but also like they don't let it go either. And I'm like, no, we need to know like the real history. Like it's okay that like most of the stuff we do is very modern, and that it was really evolving over the times. That's fine, because again, we're not actually doing what our pagan ancestors did. We don't know. So much of it was changed and lost over time. Like, I'm cool having my full legit name of my craft being Neo-Pagan Witch, which honestly you could put a little parentheses of like, technically it's kind of eclectic Wicca-ish, because witchcraft is really large. You could obviously include the occult into it, and I don't really claim the occult stuff because it also like, it talks about like the Western like mystery and like the Kabbalah a little bit. There's like a lot of stuff that are kind of in that branch but kind of not. And so anyways, this is getting to be long. Moral of the story, I think this book is something everybody should read through. It will probably take you some time. And again, try not to skim read this one. Every single paragraph, every single page actually really matters. It builds on itself, obviously, because you're starting from the beginnings as much as we can find and leading up. I'm excited to read his other books. I do need to plan more accordingly, because this is my first book I've had go overdue at the library by like a week trying to get through this. And like, that's why there's no videos. This is all I've been doing, is trying to get through this book. And like, I've tried to take some notes, and like, honestly, I was just like, I just need to buy a copy of this and then like really dissect it at some point of like things that I want to remember. But like, he brought up good points in here too. Like towards the end, he talked about how like sometimes our belief system doesn't really work. And like there was one in particular that like really hit home for me, and it was right towards the end of the book, but he was talking about, specifically at Samhain, how we have the belief in reincarnation, but then also we call upon our dead, recent and old. And he's like, I'm not here to judge how you make that work in your mind, but there are some things that we just don't talk about, because if you don't talk about it too much, you don't think about it too much, it works. Because again, a lot of Wiccan beliefs and a lot of witchcraft beliefs, you reincarnate pretty quick, but then also you can call on the ancestors. Now for me, it works. I've discussed it in my own book, my own theory of that, but it was interesting because then like at the end of that paragraph, he was like, there really isn't a lot written on like funeral rites and death rites, and I'm just sitting there like, I did though. Like it was just, like I know it's an ego little stroke right there, but like it was nice to know that it is acknowledged that the topic I wrote on in the craft is not overly saturated, that not a lot of people talk about it, and the exact point that I tried to bring up very early was also taken care of. And anyways, I'm gonna end this here because my dog is having conniptions because I think there's like a delivery dude out front. But regardless, I just was so happy that my book was kind of mentioned, not really, but like the themes that I was wanting to address of like, how can you have ancestors but reincarnate, and like, are funeral things outside of just a funeral like thing, like that part of the like rites of passage of existing is like so under discussed. And so anyways, it just made my little heart happy that I was like, oh, look at me go, because anyways, I loved this book. But yeah, there's plenty of other things in here, but I don't want to make this too terribly long. Moral of the story, I think every single person interested in paganism, witchcraft, Wicca needs to read this book. This should be one of your first year books. And like, honestly, it is really heavy to get through. It is, again, he doesn't try to talk above you, but like sometimes there's words that you're like, what? I've never seen that word before. And you try and go through the root words and everything, and it doesn't happen. And so anyways, it's a good book. It's very academic based, and it is very apparent, but it's so well written that it isn't a hindrance. It's just to plan extra time on this book. This is not a quick read. This is a sit down with a cup of tea and plan an afternoon to read a few pages, because it takes a long time, especially again if you're really trying to absorb the information, because so many of the other books get the history so wrong that it's like, it's nice to have one that actually describes it properly. So anyways, that is enough rambling. Moral of the story, I highly recommend this to every single person in witchcraft, paganism, Wicca, all of y'all. Even the occult, Western mysteries, everything really. This book you need to read. Anyways, that is it. I do plan to read more of his books at some point, and I do plan to get a copy of this for myself as well and recommend it whenever I can. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons. I'll have their names over here. If you'd like to support me and get access to exclusive content, it is patreon.com/nightwillowcrafts. Make sure to like and subscribe. I post every single day, and until next time, thank you so much for watching, and blessed be.